The story I am about to share concerns one of the darkest and most intense parts of the Old Testament, which may not be suitable for all viewers. If you think the content might trigger painful memories, I advise you to consider whether or not to watch this video. This account is found in chapters 19 to 21 of the Book of Judges. Often, many people stop reading at chapter 19 without continuing, thus missing some crucial lessons that emerge from these events. The story begins at a time when there was no true king to govern Israel. A Levite living in a remote mountainous area of Ephraim decides to take a woman from Bethlehem in Judah as his concubine. It's important to note that the Levite lives in the north of the country, while the woman is from the south. The plot thickens when the woman is unfaithful to the Levite and decides to return to her parents' home in Bethlehem, where she stays for 4 months. Disappointed but determined, the Levite sets out to reclaim his partner. The following story is full of tension and complexity, showing the rawest and often darkest side of human nature. Through this narrative, we will explore important lessons we can learn from such historical events and how they can reflect on our understanding of human behavior and social dynamics. The Levite, coming from the mountains of Ephraim in the north, undertakes a long journey south to Bethlehem to reconcile with the woman he had taken as a concubine. Upon his arrival, he is warmly welcomed by the woman's father. Day after day, the father insists that he extend his stay, always promising one more night of hospitality. However, after several delays, the Levite firmly decides to leave, despite his appreciation for the hospitality received. The journey home proves to be more complicated than expected. During their return trip, with the concubine by his side, the Levite and his servant find themselves needing to choose a place to spend the night. As the sun begins to set, they are near the city of Gibeah. The servant suggests stopping there for the night, but the Levite, preferring not to stop in a city where Israelites do not live, decides to push on towards Gibeah or Ramah, places inhabited by members of their community. As dusk envelops the landscape, they continue their journey, heading to Gibeah in the tribe of Benjamin, unaware of the tragic events that await them. After unsuccessfully seeking lodging in Gibeah, a peculiar situation given the importance of hospitality in Israeli culture, the Levite, his servant, and the concubine find themselves still in the town square in the evening. An elderly local, seeing them without shelter, approaches and offers to host them. They accept the invitation, reassuring the old man that they will not need much. They have enough food for themselves and their donkeys, and all they need is a place to rest. The elderly man welcomes the travelers into his home, offering them shelter and security for the night. However, the evening takes a dire turn. While they are in the house, a group of local men, described as wicked, gather around the dwelling and bang violently on the door. They demand that the Levite be handed over to them to abuse. This shocking request puts the homeowner in a difficult and terrible position. With great courage, the man goes out to confront the crowd, pleading with them not to commit such a vile act. He reminds them that the guest is under his protection and that violating that safety would be an unimaginable atrocity. In an attempt to protect his guest, the homeowner makes a shocking proposal. He offers his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine to the crowd, telling them to do what they wished with the women, but not to commit the atrocity against the man. Later in the video, we will address the implications of this choice, but what happens next is truly unthinkable. In verse 25, since the crowd would not listen, the Levite takes his concubine and hands her over to them. The violence that follows is one of the most horrific and disturbing parts of the story. The concubine was harmed, she was violated and mistreated repeatedly throughout the night by the crowd, until dawn, when they finally let her go. Imagine the suffering and despair of this woman, forced to endure unspeakable violence all night. Now, you understand why this video might be considered inappropriate for minors and could awaken past traumas. And here is what happens to this young woman. At dawn, she manages to return to the Levite's house. As the sun rises, she collapses at the door of the house where her master was staying. You can imagine her condition: exhausted, injured, and deeply traumatized after a night of horrific abuse. With the last of her strength, she manages to drag herself to the threshold, and there she lies down, unable to go any further, and remains motionless. Now, my friend, observe what happens next. The Levite rose in the morning, opened the doors of the house, and went out to continue his journey. There, by the door, was his concubine, collapsed with her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he said to her. "Let's go." But there was no response, for the woman had been so brutally abused during the night that she had died. With a mix of sadness and despair, the man placed her on his donkey and set off for his home. What happens next is even more tragic and shocking. When the Levite reached his home, he took a knife, seized the body of his concubine, and cut it into 12 pieces, limb by limb. He then sent each of these pieces to the 12 tribes of Israel. When the other tribes received and learned what had happened to this woman, they reacted with dismay and horror, saying, "Nothing like this has ever happened in our history." This collective reaction highlights the severity of the act and the need for a strong and united response. The story continues in chapters 20 and 21, where the consequences of these events and the decisions made by the tribes of Israel are addressed. I want you to stay with me, because now is the time to examine some important lessons we can learn from this tragic story. The first lesson we can draw from this story is the importance of accountability in our lives. Chapter 19 of the book of Judges begins by stating, "In those days there was no king in Israel." This highlights how, in the absence of authority and a system of accountability, people are more prone to stray from the right path. When we do not have to answer to anyone, we are more likely to make poor decisions because we think we can act without consequences. In Israel, without a king and with the law not respected, the lack of accountability led to behaviors that would otherwise have been unthinkable. The second important lesson is to treat every human being as bearing the image of God. In the story, we see a man offering his virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine to the crowd, believing it would be worse if they harmed the male guest. This shows a distorted mindset where the life and dignity of some people are considered less valuable than others. We must remember that every person has intrinsic value and should be treated with respect and dignity. This principle also applies in the modern context, for example, when it comes to consuming inappropriate content online. Viewing such things is wrong because it fails to recognize the dignity and value of the people involved. We should envision every person we see as bearing the image of God, as someone who could be our daughter, our sister, or a loved one. Imagining how we would feel if someone viewed a person dear to us in the same way can help us understand the importance of respecting the dignity of everyone. The third lesson I want to highlight in this video is this: the further we drift from God, the more vulnerable we become to doing things we could never have imagined ourselves doing. Looking at the book of Judges as a whole, we see a nation that gradually drifted away from God. This gradual estrangement culminates in the terrible events described in chapters 19-21, demonstrating just how far the nation had strayed from divine principles. This principle holds true for us today as well. If we do not maintain a close connection with God, we risk veering off the right path. When we drift away from God, we expose ourselves to temptations and sins we could never have imagined committing. If someone had told us 10 years ago that we would do certain things, we would have been convinced it would never happen. We would have said, "There's no way I would ever divorce my wife. There's no way I would start an extramarital affair. There's no way I would be caught watching something inappropriate online. There's no way I would end up using drugs." But the truth is that when we lose touch with our values and spiritual principles, it becomes easier to fall into wrong behaviors. The narrative continues beyond chapter 19, and unfortunately the situation deteriorates significantly in chapter 20 with the outbreak of a civil war. The 11 tribes of Israel find themselves in armed conflict against the tribe of Benjamin. The reason for this war is a horrendous crime committed by the Benjaminites against their fellow Israelite. I strongly recommend reading chapters 20 and 21 for a fuller understanding, but let me give you a preview. The ensuing battle is devastating, with enormous losses on both sides. By the end of the war, only 600 men from the tribe of Benjamin survive, with no women to marry and perpetuate their lineage. Arriving at chapter 21, the other tribes begin to feel remorse and concern for the future of the Benjaminites. There is a fear that the tribe may disappear, as the survivors are only men. Faced with this situation, a new problem emerges: how to prevent the extinction of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. This part of the story leads us to a crucial reflection. Every wrong choice carries consequences that we cannot control. The Benjaminites, having committed a serious error, now find themselves facing the repercussions. However, the 11 tribes that reacted by fighting and decimating the Benjaminites are now also forced to manage the consequences of their actions. It's important to understand that although we can decide which fault to commit, we cannot choose the consequences that ensue. Every decision has repercussions, and often we do not have the power to determine what those will be. In an attempt to correct the wrong committed, the Israelites adopt an extreme measure. They head towards the clan of Gibeah, eliminate the men, and take 400 women who had never been with a man. In an attempt to solve the problem of the scarcity of women, the 400 women from the clan of Gibeah are given to 400 of the 600 surviving Benjamite men, allowing them to form new families. However, this leaves 200 Benjamite men without the possibility of finding wives, creating another significant problem. The situation becomes further complicated when the Israelites seek to circumvent an earlier oath. They had vowed never to give their daughters in marriage to the Benjamites. The solution they come up with is surprisingly controversial. They allow the Benjamites to abduct the women during a festival at Shiloh. In this way, the Israelites are not formally giving their daughters to the Benjamites, but they still permit them to be taken. In this dramatic sequence of events, the Israelites find a controversial way to solve the problem of the Benjamite men without wives, without formally breaking their oath. They inform the Benjamites that during an upcoming festival, the young women will participate in dances and celebrations. Despite their previous commitment not to offer their daughters to the Benjamites, they suggest that if these women are abducted, the obligation would be technically avoided. Thus, during the festival, the 200 remaining Benjamite men take advantage of the opportunity to abduct the women who are dancing, taking them away to be their wives. The final reflection on this story highlights how the actions of a few can have devastating repercussions on many. Even if some Benjamite men may have deserved their fate, many others involved, who had no direct connection to the initial actions, were dragged into a spiral of violence and suffering. This narrative reminds us of how complex moral decisions can be and their profound and far-reaching implications. The tragic fate of the people of Gibeah, with the death of their men and the abduction of their women, as well as the fate of other women torn from their loved ones and taken far from their families, highlights how deeply bad decisions can affect entire communities. However, it is important to reflect on a message of hope that emerges from the narrative. Despite the destructive choices, there is the possibility of redemption and renewal. This is evidenced by the end of the book of Judges, which tells how the Benjamites, after taking the necessary women, returned to their lands, rebuilt their cities, and resumed living there. At that time, every Israelite returned to their own tribe and family, resuming life according to their own traditions and values. The final phrase of the book of Judges is particularly significant. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This reflection highlights a reality where the absence of central leadership leaves room for personal decisions that can have unpredictable consequences. It is crucial to recognize that every decision carries consequences, sometimes incalculable and inevitable. As we conclude this story and prepare for the next video, I wish to leave you with a thought. Carefully consider your choices, because each one will influence not only your life, but also those of others around you. Thank you for watching this video. Goodbye, and may God bless you.